The day Frances Monroe arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a broken heart, and a loaded Derringer tucked into her boot, the whole town stopped breathing for just a moment. It was the spring of 1874, and the Texas panhandle had been baking under a relentless sun that showed no mercy to the living and even less to the dead. Frances stepped off the stagecoach onto the cracked red earth of Dusty Creek's main street and squinted against the light. Her dark hair pinned up beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, her green eyes sharp and assessing as they swept the town before her. She was 23 years old, strong in the way that women who had survived genuine hardship were strong, with a set to her jaw that said she had not come this far to be turned back by anything as ordinary as difficulty. She had come to Dusty Creek for a job. The letter in her pocket, creased and soft from being read so many times, was from a man named Gerald Hopsworth, who ran the only hotel in town and needed someone to manage the front desk, cook the morning meals, and keep his ledger straight. He had advertised in 3 different Texas newspapers, and Frances had been the first to respond. She had been living in San Antonio at the time, working as a seamstress in a shop owned by a woman who paid her barely enough to eat, and the promise of room, board, and a modest salary in Dusty Creek had seemed like the answer to a prayer she had been sending up for months. What Gerald Hopsworth's letter had not mentioned was that he had died of a heart attack 2 weeks before Frances left San Antonio. She learned this from the stagecoach driver, who had delivered enough mail to Dusty Creek to know the general state of its affairs. He had told her matter-of-factly, with the kind of bluntness that people in the territories had learned was more useful than gentleness, as he handed down her bag. Frances had stood there absorbing the information, the hot wind lifting the hem of her dress, the dust settling around her boots, and she had thought, very calmly, that she was going to figure this out. She had not come 500 miles by stagecoach to be defeated by bad timing. The town of Dusty Creek was not much to look at. There was a main street with a general store, the hotel, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a small church, a livery stable, a barber, and a sheriff's office that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never properly finished. Beyond the main street, a scatter of houses spread out in no particular order, like seeds thrown from an open hand. To the north, the land opened up into wide cattle country, flat and gold and seemingly without end. To the south, a dry creek bed traced a pale line through the brush, and beyond that, the land rose slightly into low hills that turned purple at dusk. Frances walked into the hotel with her bag over her arm and her chin up. The woman behind the front desk was in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she found most things in life mildly irritating. Her name was Edna Hopsworth, and she was Gerald's widow, and she had taken over the running of the hotel with the grim efficiency of someone who had no other choice. She looked at Frances with eyes that missed nothing. "You must be the girl from San Antonio," Edna said. "Frances Monroe," Frances confirmed. "I'm very sorry about your husband, ma'am." "I didn't know until I arrived." Edna studied her for a long moment. "Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you keep a ledger?" "Better than most." "Can you handle difficult men without causing a scene?" Frances thought of the Derringer in her boot. "I have a talent for managing difficult situations." Something shifted in Edna's expression, not quite a smile, but the near cousin of one. "The job still pays $20 a month and includes the small room on the 2nd floor. Gerald may be gone, but this hotel still needs running, and I am not as young as I was. Can you start tomorrow?" "I can start this afternoon," Frances said. That was how she came to Dusty Creek. That was how it all began. She had been there 3 days before she met John Whitfield. Those 3 days were full enough on their own. Frances learned the hotel, which had 12 rooms and was more often than not at half capacity. She learned the morning routine, which began before the sun was up and involved a cast-iron stove, 3 dozen eggs, a slab of salt pork, and the kind of coffee that could strip paint. She learned which guests were reliable and which needed to be watched, which traveling salesmen left good tips, and which left their rooms in a state that made her want to say things that were not ladylike. She learned the town slowly, absorbing it in pieces the way you learn any new place, by walking its edges, by listening to its voices, by watching who watched her back. She was aware in those first 3 days of a particular tension in Dusty Creek that she could not immediately name. People spoke in lowered voices about something at the edge of their town, some difficulty or danger that they did not quite spell out but that hummed beneath every conversation like a low note. The name Cutter came up more than once. Boyd Cutter. She filed it away. She met John Whitfield on a Tuesday morning at the counter of the general store, where she had been sent by Edna to pick up a sack of flour and some salt. He was leaning against the counter with the loose, easy posture of a man who was comfortable in his body and in the world which was, Frances would later think, the first thing she noticed. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a working rancher's clothes, dusty and worn but not dirty, and a wide-brimmed hat that he had pushed back on his head so that she could see his face clearly. His eyes were a particular shade of brown, warm and direct, with a quality to them that she would spend a long time trying to put words to before she finally settled on honest. He was talking to the storekeeper, a barrel-shaped man named Pete Drummond, and the conversation appeared to be about a broken wagon axle and the difficulty of getting parts in a town this size. Frances waited her turn at the counter, not listening exactly but not pretending she couldn't hear either. "You must be the new woman at Edna's hotel," the man said, and Frances realized with a small start that he was looking at her now with that direct, unhurried gaze. "I must be," she agreed. He smiled at that, not a big smile, just a pulling at the corner of his mouth, but it changed his face in a way that was difficult to look away from. "John Whitfield," he said. "I run the Whitfield Ranch about 4 miles north of town." "Frances Monroe," she said. "I manage the front desk and cook the breakfasts." "Well, Miss Monroe," Pete Drummond said from behind the counter, heaving the flour sack up onto the surface, "you will want to get yourself acquainted with this town pretty quick. Things are not as settled here as they might appear." She looked at him. "I've heard the name Boyd Cutter mentioned." The silence that followed that statement had weight to it. Pete and John exchanged a look, the kind that passes between men who know the same difficult truth. "Boyd Cutter," John said, and his voice had lost its easy quality and taken on something careful and measured, "is a man who has decided that a good portion of the land in this county belongs to him, whether or not the law agrees. He has a crew of about 15 riders. He has been pushing smaller ranchers off their land for 3 years. He has also taken a particular interest in certain properties along the creek road." "Properties like yours?" Frances asked. John looked at her steadily. "Properties like mine," he confirmed. She picked up the flour sack and settled it under her arm. "I see," she said. "Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Whitfield." She walked out of the store with the flour and the salt, and she told herself very firmly that she had not just noticed the way he watched her go. The following weeks established a rhythm. Frances was good at her work, which was a satisfaction to her in the simple and fundamental way that competence always is. The hotel's breakfasts became known around town as the best meal available in Dusty Creek, and several people who had no rooms to stay in began appearing at the dining table each morning simply because they did not want to miss the biscuits. Edna raised her salary to $25 after the first month, which was not a thing Edna did without considerable internal struggle, and Frances understood this to be a significant compliment. John Whitfield came to breakfast on Thursdays. She told herself this was coincidence the first 2 times. After the third and fourth, she stopped telling herself anything about it and simply began, without quite meaning to, making sure Thursday mornings were particularly good. The apple preserves she put out were always fresh on Thursdays. The coffee was always strong enough but not punishing. The biscuits were always golden. He always sat at the second table from the window. He always ordered the same thing, eggs and salt pork and biscuits with the apple preserves. He always read a 3-day-old newspaper while he ate or pretended to, and Frances had begun to notice that the paper was often upside down. They talked. That was the thing. It happened gradually, the way rivers form, not in a single moment but through the continuous flow of smaller moments that accumulate into something significant. He would ask her where she was from. She would tell him about San Antonio, about the seamstress shop, about the long stagecoach ride with the dust coming through every gap in the leather. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle, about his father who had built the place from a single section of raw land in 1859 and worked himself into an early grave, making it something worth having. He had come to Dusty Creek when he was 9 years old. He knew every inch of this country. "Do you love it?" she asked him once, refilling his coffee cup. "The land, I mean. After everything Cutter has been doing to people here, do you still love it?" He thought about this with the seriousness that she was coming to understand was fundamental to his character, the quality of giving genuine consideration to questions that deserved it. "I love it the way you love something that has cost you a great deal," he finally said. "It is not a simple feeling, but yes, I love it." She understood this better than she would have expected. She had loved San Antonio in a similar way, loved it through its difficulties, loved it even when it was harsh. The capacity to love something complicated and demanding seemed to her one of the more important capacities a person could have. She thought about this later, in her room above the hotel, lying on her narrow bed and watching the moonlight stretch across the ceiling, and she thought that she was in significant danger and that she should probably do something about it. Then she thought about the way his eyes went warm when she said something that made him laugh. Then she thought she was probably not going to do anything about it at all. It was in the 6th week of her time in Dusty Creek that the trouble with Boyd Cutter became impossible to ignore. It began with Luther Payne. Luther was a farmer who had a small homestead about 2 miles east of John's ranch, an older man, gray-bearded and quiet, who came to town once a week for supplies and always tipped his hat to Frances when he passed the hotel. She had heard from various people that Luther had been farming his section of land for 11 years, that he had built his house with his own hands, that he grew corn and kept chickens, and wanted nothing from anyone except to be left alone to work his ground. Boyd Cutter wanted Luther's land because it sat along a stretch of the creek that still had water in it most of the year, which in this country was worth more than gold. Luther came into the hotel on a Wednesday morning with a black eye and a cut across his cheekbone, and he sat down at the dining table even though breakfast had been over for 2 hours, and Frances brought him coffee without being asked and sat down across from him. "Cutter's men," he said flatly, "came to the farm last night, told me I had 1 week to clear out." Frances felt a cold anger settle in her stomach. "And the sheriff?" Luther looked at her with the tired eyes of a man who has stopped expecting much from official channels. "Sheriff Henley is a good man who has 7 deputies and Boyd Cutter has 15 armed riders. Tom Henley does what he can, but there are limits to what one sheriff can do." "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I built that farm. I am 61 years old and I do not have anywhere else to go, and I do not know what I am going to do." Frances went to find John Whitfield that same afternoon. She did not fully examine why she went to him specifically, except that he was the person in this town whose judgment she trusted most and whose knowledge of the situation was the deepest. She saddled one of Edna's old horses and rode north out of town with the afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders. The Whitfield ranch sat in a shallow bowl of land with a good windbreak of cottonwoods along the eastern edge, and a barn that was better built than most houses Frances had seen. There were cattle visible in the distance, a dark moving mass against the golden grass, and several hands working near the corrals. John was in the yard when she rode up, mending a section of fence, and he looked up at the sound of her horse with an expression of surprise that she noted with private satisfaction. "Miss Monroe," he said, straightening. "Luther Payne came to the hotel this morning," she said without preamble. Cutter's men beat him and told him to leave his farm. John set down his tools. The easy quality left his face entirely. How bad is he hurt? Bad enough. Not as bad as it could have been. I think they meant to threaten rather than seriously damage him this time. She dismounted and stood looking at him directly. There has to be something that can be done about this. There must be. He was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the land. I have been talking to some of the other ranchers, he said carefully. Tom Henley has written 3 times to the county seat asking for additional law enforcement. The letters have not produced anything yet. I have been thinking about approaching the Texas Rangers. That takes time, she said. Luther may not have time. I know. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was difficult to interpret, a complexity of feelings that she could see he was working through. You rode out here for this, he said. It was not a question exactly. Someone needed to. You have been in this town 6 weeks, he said. Luther Payne is not your responsibility. She looked at him steadily. He is a person, she said. That makes him everyone's responsibility, doesn't it? Something in him went very still for a moment, and then something else happened in his face, something warm and unguarded that he did not quite manage to conceal before she saw it, and Frances felt the cold anger in her stomach replaced by something considerably less cold. Have supper with me, he said. It came out more directly than she suspected he had intended, because he looked briefly surprised by his own words. Here at the ranch. Hattie cooks on Wednesdays and she always makes too much. Frances considered this for exactly 2 seconds. All right, she said. Hattie was John's ranch cook, a formidable woman of indeterminate age who had learned to cook on a cattle drive and whose biscuits were, Frances was forced to admit, very nearly as good as her own. She served them roasted chicken and beans and cornbread at the long kitchen table, and she looked at Frances with an expression of open and undisguised assessment that Frances met without flinching, and that apparently satisfied Hattie, because she topped up Frances's coffee twice without being asked, which was Hattie's way of indicating approval. They ate and they talked, and the conversation wound through territory both practical and personal, in the way that conversations between 2 people who are paying very close attention to each other tend to do. They talked about Cutter and what could be done. They talked about the Texas Rangers, whose nearest company was stationed at a fort a hard 2-day ride from Dusty Creek. They talked about organizing the smaller ranchers, about whether numbers could compensate for the disadvantage of being outgunned. Then they talked about other things. About the way the panhandle looked in the early morning light when the land was still cool, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only existed for about 20 minutes before the sun climbed high enough to wash it out. About the stories his father had told him of building this ranch. About a dog she had loved as a child in Missouri, before her parents died, and she had gone to live with an aunt in San Antonio. She had not meant to tell him about her parents. It came out in the natural flow of things, the way genuine conversation sometimes carries you further than you plan to go. How old were you? He asked, and his voice had gone quiet and attentive. 14, she said. Fever took them both within a week of each other. My aunt was a decent woman, but she had 5 children of her own, and there was not much room for me in her house or her heart. I was not unhappy, exactly, but I was very much alone. You don't seem like a person who stays down, he said. I had to learn not to, she agreed. It took some time. He was looking at her with that honest quality in his eyes, that warm directness, and she was looking back at him. And the kitchen had gone quiet around them, the fire in the stove settling into embers, the night sounds beginning outside the window, and Frances thought that she had ridden out here for Luther Payne, and that was entirely true. But she was also aware that it was not the only true thing about why she had come. She rode back to town in the early dark, with the stars enormous overhead and the nighthawks calling, and she felt something moving through her that she recognized after a moment as happiness, clean and uncomplicated, which surprised her because she had not felt it in so long that she had half forgotten what it was like. Over the next week, John came into town more often than usual. He stopped at the hotel not only on Thursday mornings, but on Tuesday afternoons and Friday evenings, on pretexts that became progressively less convincing, and Frances received each pretextual visit with a straight face and the apple preserves freshly put out. They walked together along the main street on 2 evenings, talking, and people noticed, which was inevitable in a town of this size, and the noticing produced a kind of murmur that Frances was aware of without particularly caring about. Edna watched all of this with sharp eyes and said nothing until one morning when she and Frances were making up the rooms together, and Edna remarked, with the studied casualness of someone who had been rehearsing a comment, "John Whitfield is a good man. His father was a good man before him." "I know he is," Frances said, tucking in a corner of the bedsheet. "He has been alone a long time," Edna added. "His wife died in 1870, childbed fever, the baby too." He does not talk about it. Frances absorbed this quietly. It settled in her understanding of him, filling in a particular shape that had been there but unnamed, a quality of careful restraint in the way he held his feelings, a gentleness that had been forged in loss rather than luck. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Edna picked up her side of the sheet and said nothing more, which was its own kind of communication. The situation with Cutter came to a head on a Friday in late July, when the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees, and the air smelled of hot dust and trouble. John had organized a meeting at the church, pulling together the 8 smaller ranchers and farmers who were most directly threatened by Cutter's expansion. Frances was not invited exactly, but she came, because she had been the one to draft the letters to the county seat and the letter to the ranger company, and she knew the language of those letters and might be called upon to explain anything that needed explanation. She sat at the back of the church in the hot afternoon light while 8 sunburned men argued about what to do, and she listened and she thought, and when the argument had been going in circles for 20 minutes she stood up. "Excuse me," she said. They all looked at her, the surprise of being addressed by a woman at a meeting of this kind written plainly on several faces. John, who was standing at the front, looked at her with an expression that contained both curiosity and the beginning of a smile. "The arguments for waiting for ranger involvement and the arguments for organizing a direct defense are not mutually exclusive," she said clearly. "You can send a man to the ranger company today now, without waiting another week, while simultaneously making sure that Luther Payne's farm and Mr. Whitfield's land are not left undefended. Cutter is betting that you will not organize. Organizing is your best response. The Rangers will take time, but they will come, and Cutter knows it, and he is moving fast precisely because he knows the clock is running." There was a silence. "She's right," said a man named Cal Dupree, who ran the Double D cattle operation to the west. "She's absolutely right." "Who is sending the rider to the Rangers?" asked another man. "I will go myself," John said. Frances looked at him. "That will leave your ranch without its best man." "My foreman, Pete Vasquez, can handle anything that comes in the next 3 days," John said. "And if I go myself, the Rangers will take the request more seriously than if I send a hired hand." This was probably true. Frances sat back down and said nothing more, and the meeting reached its conclusions. 2 men would ride out to stay with Luther Payne, rotating through the week on a schedule they drew up then and there. A watch would be established along the creek road, and John would ride to the ranger company the next morning. He came to find her after the meeting, outside the church in the brief cool of the early evening. "Thank you for what you said in there," he told her. "I said what was obvious," she said. Someone needed to say it. He smiled at that because she had said something similar before, and he remembered. "I will be back in 3 or 4 days," he said. Then, after a brief pause with a slight change of quality in his voice, "I want you to be careful while I am gone, Frances." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed on her like warm sunlight. "I am always careful," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it." He rode out the next morning before first light, and Frances watched from the hotel window as his dark silhouette moved up the main street and then out the north road, growing smaller until the distance absorbed it. The 3 days he was gone were 3 days in which she understood, with perfect clarity, what had happened to her. She had not been looking for this. She had come to Dusty Creek for a job, for a salary, for room and board, for a chance at something manageable and her own. She had not come looking for a man to think about at every odd moment, to look for out windows, to miss with a specific and physical quality, as though someone had removed something warm from a place where it had been resting. She had fallen in love with John Whitfield, and she knew it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because Frances Monroe had very limited patience for self-deception. What she did not know was what he felt. He had been warm with her, interested, attentive in ways that went beyond ordinary friendliness. He had used her given name. He had asked her to be careful in a voice that carried more than practical concern. But he was also a man who had lost his wife and his child, and she understood from what Edna had told her that these losses had not healed cleanly, that they had left something in him that was cautious and careful in ways that love had made necessary. She would wait. She was patient when she needed to be. He came back on a Wednesday evening, riding up the main street with the dust of 2 hard days' travel on him, and he went to the hotel first, not to his ranch, and she was behind the front desk when he walked through the door. He looked at her for a moment before he said anything. "The Rangers are coming," he said. "Captain Miles Hargrove and 6 men. They will be here within the week." "That is excellent news," she said, and she was aware that her voice had gone slightly warmer than she intended. "Everything all right here while I was gone. Cutter's men rode past Luther's farm twice, but they kept their distance. The watch along the creek road seems to be working." She paused. "We have a room available if you need to stay the night before riding back." He looked at her for another moment in that direct way. "I think I need some of Hattie's cooking," he said, "and a proper night's sleep. Tomorrow morning will do for the ranch." A pause. "Will you have breakfast with me? Not at the dining table. I mean, will you have breakfast with me, just the 2 of us, before everyone else is up?" The dining room would be empty at 5:30 in the morning. The world would be dark and quiet outside, the town not yet woken. It was not by any stretch an improper suggestion, but the privacy of it, the intentionality, made her heart do something her heart had not done in years. "Yes," she said, "I will." She was up at 5 as always, and had the coffee on and the eggs beginning when he came downstairs, and they sat across from each other in the empty dining room with the darkness pressing against the windows and the lamp between them, and they ate and they talked, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, with no particular announcement, everything shifted. He told her about the ride to the Rangers, about Captain Hargrove, a compact and efficient man in his 40s who had looked at John's documentation, and said, with the brevity of a man who did not waste words, that he had been waiting for someone to bring him a sufficiently clear case against Boyd Cutter for 2 years. He told her about the night he had slept on the plain, rolled in his blanket under those enormous stars, and had thought about Dusty Creek and about whether, if the Cutter situation resolved itself, he could think about making it the kind of place worth putting down roots in for good. "Don't you already have roots here?" she asked, because he had been here most of his life. "I have land," he said. "That is different from roots in the end. Roots require more than a man alone." He was looking at her steadily across the table, and the lamp between them was making warm light on his face, and he said, quietly and without drama, "I think about the future differently than I did 6 months ago." "Differently how?" she asked, though she was already fairly certain what he meant. "Before you came," he said carefully, "I was managing. I was running the ranch, and I was fine, and I was not, as far as I could tell, missing anything specifically. And then you arrived, and I walked into Pete Drummond's store, and there you were, with that flour sack under your arm and that look on your face like you had already decided this town was worth figuring out, and something shifted." He was not a man who spoke easily about his feelings. She could see the effort this was costing him, but he was doing it anyway, which she thought was one of the bravest things she had seen in some time. "I should have said something before this," he added. "I am saying it now." "You are not very fast," she agreed, "but you are very thorough." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from his chest, and she thought that she could listen to that laugh every day for the rest of her life and never grow tired of it. "Frances," he said, "would you allow me to court you properly? I mean dinners and Sunday afternoons and riding out together and all of it properly done, so that when I ask you the question I am thinking of asking you in a few months, it won't come out of nowhere." She was quiet for a moment, not because she needed to think about the answer, but because she wanted to hold this moment exactly as it was for a few seconds, the lamplight and the dark windows and this man sitting across from her with everything he had just put on the table between them. "John," she said, "I would be very pleased to be courted properly by you." Captain Miles Hargrove and his 6 Rangers rode into Dusty Creek 4 days later on a Thursday morning, and half the town turned out to watch them come up the main street. They were a lean and weathered group, all business, and Hargrove's eyes swept the street in a single professional assessment that took in everything and filed it. They met with Sheriff Henley first, and then with John and the other ranchers, and Frances sat in on that meeting because she had drafted the documentation and knew its contents better than anyone. Hargrove read the letters and the affidavits that had been collected, the accounts of intimidation and assault and illegal land seizure, and his expression did not change much, but his eyes sharpened in a way that was satisfying to watch. "I have a warrant for Cutter's arrest that I've been waiting to execute," Hargrove said. "The situation you have described here is sufficient grounds. We will move in the morning." The arrest of Boyd Cutter and 7 of his riders the following dawn was conducted with the quiet, precise efficiency that the Texas Rangers were known for, and it was, in Frances's estimation, far less dramatic than the weeks of tension that had preceded it. Cutter was a broad, red-faced man who shouted a great deal about his rights and his lawyers, and made several threats that Hargrove received with patient indifference, and then he was manacled and put on a horse and taken away toward the county seat, and it was done. Dusty Creek exhaled. Luther Payne came to the hotel that evening and shook Frances's hand with both of his and told her that if she ever needed anything in her life, she could come to him, and she understood that he meant it entirely. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Frances's time in Texas. She and John courted in the formal and unhurried way he had promised, which was in practice both formal and very thoroughly not formal, because they were both people who talked without constraint when they were comfortable, and they were comfortable with each other very quickly. They rode out on Sunday afternoons across the Golden Land, John pointing out things about the country that she could not have seen without his knowledge. The way certain grasses indicated underground water, the patterns of cattle movement, the places where the light fell on the hills at evening in a way that was specifically beautiful. She told him things in return, things about herself that she had not told many people, about her childhood in Missouri, about the years of loneliness in San Antonio, about the particular quality of hope that had been required to step off that stagecoach in Dusty Creek with a broken plan and a loaded Derringer, and no certainty of anything at all. "You are the bravest person I know," he said one afternoon, as they sat on a rise of land to the north of the ranch with the whole panhandle spread out below them, the sky enormous and the light going gold and amber as evening came. "I was frightened," she said. "I was frightened a good deal of the time." "I know," he said. "That is what brave means, being frightened and doing it anyway." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she had come to know and love, the warmth and the honesty and something underneath them that was vast and serious. He had his hat off and his hair was ruffled by the wind, and he was, she thought, absolutely the right person for her, the right person for this place and this time, and she wondered if it was possible to feel this kind of certainty about something and be wrong. She did not think it was. "John," she said, because she was also brave and also not willing to wait for something that was very clearly ready to happen. "I love you." He looked at her for a long, full moment, and she could see something in him going very still and then something else happening, something that was the opposite of still, something that was warm and moving and alive. "I love you, Frances," he said. "I have for some time. I was working up to it." "I know," she said. "You are very thorough." He laughed, and then he did not laugh, and he reached over and took her hand, and they sat there on the hill in the evening light with the land below them and the sky above, and it was one of those moments that are so complete in themselves that time seems to pause to accommodate them. They rode back to town as the stars were coming out, and he walked her to the hotel door and held her hand for another moment at the threshold before he said good night. And Frances went up to her room above the hotel and stood at the window looking out at the dark Main Street, and felt something so fundamentally different from loneliness that she had to invent a new category to put it in. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, John asked her to marry him. He asked her at the ranch, in the yard, while Hattie made a very transparent show of finding something to do in the barn that required her immediate and prolonged attention. The sun was just down, the sky still holding a long band of deep rose and orange in the west, and the cottonwoods were rustling in an evening breeze. He had clearly thought about how to do this. He was standing straight and his eyes were direct, and he was holding a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small ruby that caught the last of the light. "Frances Monroe," he said, "I have been alone a long time, and I did not know for a long time that alone was what I was. You have made me understand the difference between managing and living. I want to live with you in this place for as long as we have. Will you marry me?" She had been looking at him with all the attention she possessed, taking in every detail of this moment the way you take in the details of something you are going to want to remember for the rest of your life. The yard and the cottonwoods and the fading rose sky, and this man who was honest and careful and brave in his own quiet way and who loved her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and then she was in his arms, and his face was in her hair, and she could feel him exhale, a long breath that released something held a long time, and she understood that this too was a kind of courage. Hattie found something to do in the barn for another 20 minutes. They were married in October, in the small church in Dusty Creek, in the kind of wedding that the panhandle did well, plain and warm and real, with half the town in attendance. Edna Hopsworth sat in the front pew with her steel-gray hair and her expression of mild irritation fully in abeyance for once, and Frances thought she saw something that might have been a tear on Edna's cheek as the vows were exchanged, though Edna would have denied it vigorously. Luther Payne was there in his best suit, which showed the honest wear of a man who did not have many occasions for his best suit. Cal Dupree came with his wife, a broad-shouldered woman named Josephine, who embraced Frances warmly in the church doorway and told her she had done something very good for this town simply by being in it, which was the most generous thing anyone had said to Frances in years. Sheriff Henley was there with his 7 deputies, all of them in their cleanest shirts. Pete Drummond was there. Hattie was there in a blue dress that she had evidently been saving for a significant occasion. Frances wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons that had taken her 4 evenings to sew on correctly. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that John had ridden out to find that morning, and had presented to her with such a look of concentrated effort that she had laughed, and then kissed him on the cheek right there in the hotel doorway, to the delighted scandal of 2 traveling salesmen who had chosen an excellent week to stay at Edna's. The ceremony was short, and the words were familiar, and Frances said them with the full force of a person who does not make promises lightly and means every syllable. When the minister said they were married and John looked at her with those warm, honest eyes, she thought that she had arrived in Dusty Creek with a broken plan and a loaded Derringer, and had somehow, through a combination of stubbornness and luck, and whatever it was that moved people toward the things they were meant to have, arrived at this. They moved into the ranch house together, which John had spent 3 weeks preparing for her arrival by whitewashing the inside walls and building a new chest of drawers and putting up a proper window on the south side of the bedroom so that the morning light would come in. Frances brought her carpetbag and her books and the small framed photograph of her parents that was one of the only things she had carried from Missouri through all the years and all the moves, and she set it on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. And John looked at it and then at her and said nothing, which was exactly right. She kept working at the hotel for another 2 months because Edna needed her and because Frances was not the kind of person who left a job unfinished. And she found a young woman named Clara Bridges who was looking for work and who had a quick mind and capable hands. And she trained Clara thoroughly and transitioned everything over in December. And Edna accepted this with the only slightly injured dignity of a woman who had always known it was coming. The ranch had 2 full-time hands besides Pete Vasquez, a young man named Domingo who was 18 and learning everything as fast as he could take it in, and an older man called Grady who had been working cattle his whole life and had opinions about it. Frances learned the ranch the way she had learned the hotel, by paying close attention and asking questions and making herself useful in ways that were not always the obvious ones. She kept the ranch's accounts and discovered that John, who was an excellent rancher, was a mediocre bookkeeper, and that with proper ledger management, they could redirect a significant amount of money toward improving the cattle stock. John looked at her analysis with the expression of a man who has just realized something important. "I have been losing money right here for 3 years," he said, indicating a particular line in her revised accounts. "Not losing exactly," she said, "more that you were not finding it." He looked at her with that warm pull at the corner of his mouth. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said. The same thing in a different dress. Winter came to the Panhandle with a particular quality of cold that Frances had not experienced in San Antonio. A dry, biting cold that came with a wind that scoured everything flat and made the horizon sharp as a knife. The ranch house was solid and warm, the stove throwing good heat, and the evenings were long and domestic and deeply satisfying in ways she had not anticipated. She had not understood before this that domestic could be a word with so much happiness in it. They read in the evenings, both of them, Frances with the books she had accumulated, and John with whatever reading material made it out to Dusty Creek on the stage, which was intermittent but not entirely absent. They played cards sometimes, and John was a better card player than she was, which she found annoying and said so, which made him laugh every time. They talked endlessly, the conversation of 2 people who had found in each other an inexhaustible source of interest, the conversation that begins in the first weeks and does not stop for decades. In February, Frances knew she was pregnant. She told John on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the winter light white and clear through the south window he had built for her. She had thought carefully about how to say it, and in the end had said it simply, the way she said most important things. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He went very still. She knew about his first child, the one who had not survived, and she watched his face with the careful attention of someone who is ready to be present for whatever comes next. She saw the stillness and then something working through him, something that was fear and hope in proportions that were almost equal, and then slowly the hope gained ground. "Frances," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know," she said. "I know it is complicated for you. We don't have to talk about everything right now. But I wanted you to know." He got up from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair so that they were level and took both her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very bright. "We are going to be all right," he said, and she understood that he was saying it as much to himself as to her, as a kind of promise or a kind of prayer. "You and I and this baby, we are going to be all right." "Yes," she said, "we are." He was very careful with her after that, in a way that was both touching and occasionally excessive, and she let him be excessive because she understood what it came from, and because being cared for by this man was something she was still, even months into their marriage, not entirely accustomed to and always moved by. Spring came back to the Panhandle, and with it the particular resurrection that this country performed every year, the grass coming green and the wildflowers scattered across the plain, and the sky that impossible morning blue for those 20 minutes before the sun climbed. The cattle were moved to the summer pastures, and Domingo learned to ride a cutting horse without falling off, which took longer than anyone had expected and involved 3 separate incidents that became part of the ranch's permanent oral history. Grady and Pete Vasquez argued about the best technique for dehorning, and the argument lasted the better part of 3 weeks before Grady conceded a partial victory to Pete with the injured dignity of a man who has lost a point, but not the war. Frances's pregnancy progressed well. She was healthy and energetic and practical about it, making adjustments as needed and not making adjustments that were not needed. And she was helped enormously by a woman in town named Dr. Maria Reyes, who was the only female doctor in a radius of 200 miles, and who had been educated at a college in the East before coming west with her husband, a cattle buyer named Francisco. Maria was clear-eyed and capable, and Frances trusted her completely, which was a comfort John valued almost as much as Frances did. Luther Payne stopped by the ranch in April with a basket of vegetables from his farm, the first vegetables of the season, and stayed for supper, and Frances was glad to see him looking well and easy in himself. The tension of the Cutter years lifted from his face. Boyd Cutter had been tried in the county seat in March and convicted on multiple counts including extortion and assault, and had been sentenced to 12 years in the state prison, and his riders had scattered, and the land he had accumulated through illegal means had been returned through a process that was not entirely smooth or fast, but that was proceeding. Dusty Creek was settling into something more like peace. The summer was warm and long and full. Frances found that she loved the ranch the way John had said he loved it, with a feeling that was not simple but that was deep, the kind of love that comes from putting your work and your days into something and watching it answer back. She had grown a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, and it was doing well, which gave her a satisfaction that was entirely disproportionate to its practical importance, and that she chose not to examine too closely. The baby was born in September. It was a hard labor, 20 hours, and Maria Reyes was there from the beginning, steady and competent, and John was somewhere in the house the whole time, close enough that Frances could hear him moving, and this was its own kind of comfort. At the end of the 20 hours there was a cry that remade the world completely, and Maria placed a baby in Frances's arms, and Frances looked down at this small new person and felt something that did not have a name yet. Something so large and so specific that it had to expand every category she had previously used for love. "Boy," Maria said, smiling. "Good strong lungs." John came in, and when he saw his son for the first time, Frances watched his face do something it had perhaps never done before, open completely. No reserve at all, only this pure and uncomplicated love that swept away everything else, and she thought she had never loved him more than in this specific moment. "Hello," he said to the baby, as though they were being formally introduced, and Frances laughed despite everything, the exhaustion and the aftermath, and John looked up at her, and his face was wet and neither of them said anything about it. They named him Robert William Whitfield. Robert for John's father and William because Frances had a great uncle William who had been the kindest person she had known in her childhood. Robbie, they called him from the start, before he was a day old. Robbie was, from his first weeks, a person with opinions. He did not sleep when sleeping was convenient for anyone else. He ate with a focused intensity that suggested he took the project very seriously. He regarded the world with dark eyes that were eventually going to be the same shade of brown as his father's, and he had his mother's stubborn chin, which John pointed out with great and poorly concealed delight. "He already looks like he is about to argue with something," John said, when Robbie was 2 weeks old. "He comes by it honestly," Frances said. The first year of Robbie's life was exhausting and extraordinary in the way that the first year of a baby's life always is, the kind of exhaustion that is so mixed with wonder that you can't separate them and stop trying. Frances and John moved through it together, dividing the nights and the mornings with a practical flexibility, learning their son as he learned the world, discovering that parenting a specific actual child was entirely different from any prior ideas either of them had had about it. Hattie was besotted with Robbie in a way that she would have denied if anyone had used the word besotted to her face, but the evidence was overwhelming, including the hand-knitted blanket that appeared on the cradle one morning, and that could only have come from Hattie's hands and Hattie's heart. The ranch continued to thrive. Frances's accounting work had freed up resources that John reinvested in better cattle stock, and by the following spring, the herd quality had improved sufficiently to get a better price at market. They hired a third hand, a quiet Mexican man named Tomas who had come up from Chihuahua and who turned out to be the best horseman any of them had seen, with a particular gift for working with difficult animals. Dusty Creek itself was growing slowly, as the Texas Panhandle continued to fill in with settlers, and the railroad talked about extending a line that would bring the cattle market closer. There was a new schoolteacher arrived in town, a young man from Ohio named Bernard Fletcher, and there was talk of building a proper schoolhouse. On an evening in the following May, Frances and John sat on the porch of the ranch house with Robbie asleep inside and the last of the light going out in the west, the sky going through its evening colors, and Frances was quiet for a while and then said, "I think I would like to do something with the accounting. Not just ours. For the other ranchers too, some of them are in the same situation you were, not losing money exactly but not finding it either." John looked at her. "You want to set up a proper accounting practice? Something like that. I could do it from here or from a small office in town. Edna might know of a space." "Edna would definitely know of a space," John agreed. He was smiling. "You have never been a person who needs permission for things," he observed. "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to talk to you first." "I think it is a remarkable idea," he said, "and I think you should do it." She looked at him in the evening light and felt the familiar quality of gratitude and love that she had learned were not two different things but one thing, the same feeling wearing different clothes depending on the moment. "I love you," she said. "I love you, Frances," he said, the same way he always did, simply and directly, as though the words cost nothing because they were true. She set up her accounting practice the following fall, in a small office that she rented from Edna for a nominal amount, one room with a good desk, and a window onto the main street. She worked 3 days a week while Hattie watched Robbie, and within 6 months she had 8 clients, including Cal Dupree and Luther Payne, and a new homesteader named Wilson who had come in from Kansas with a wife and 4 children, and a determination to make something in this country. Frances found in the work a deep satisfaction that was entirely her own, separate from the ranch and the marriage and the motherhood, and she understood that this was not a thing to feel guilty about, that a woman's own work and her own satisfaction were good things, things that made everything else better. The winter of 1876 was cold and long, and they came through it well. Robbie was walking by then, a determined waddle that accelerated dangerously on the porch stairs, and he had begun to add words to his vocabulary at a rate that suggested he had been waiting impatiently for the capacity and intended to make up for lost time. His favorite word that winter was "no," which he deployed with a precision and frequency that his father found funnier than his mother did, though his mother also found it funny in private. In March, Frances learned she was pregnant again. This time there was less complicated feeling about it. She told John over breakfast, and he took her hand across the table and smiled at her with everything he had. "Another one to argue with us," he said. "At least," she agreed. This pregnancy was easier than the first, which Maria Reyes attributed to the second one, always being something the body knows better. Frances continued her accounting work into the 7th month, accommodating the expanding logistics with the practical adaptability that was her dominant characteristic, and she finally handed the most demanding accounts temporarily to a young man named Sam Fowler who had come to her the previous year asking to learn bookkeeping, and who had turned out to have a real talent for numbers. In October, their second child was born. A girl this time, small and determined, with Frances's green eyes and a fierce and focused look that Hattie described as exactly like her mother from the very first day. They named her Clara Jane Whitfield, Clara for the woman who had taken over Frances's work at the hotel, and Jane for no particular reason except that it suited her. She was called Clary almost immediately, another small person with opinions arriving in a household already well stocked with them. Dusty Creek continued to grow and change through those years. The railroad came through in 1877, not directly through the town, but close enough to transform it. A cattle loading station established 2 miles east that brought business and people and complication in the usual proportions that growth brings. Bernard Fletcher's school was built, a proper 2-room building with a stove and good desks and a bell on the roof, and John served on the school board because Frances asked him to, and because he understood that the school was one of the most important things the town could have. Frances's accounting practice expanded to 12 clients and then 16, and she took Sam Fowler on formally as a junior partner, which he received with a seriousness that was touching. Edna Hopsworth, who had continued to run the hotel with advancing years and diminishing patience for nonsense, finally agreed to sell the business to Clara Bridges, who had been effectively running it for 2 years already. The sale was handled by Frances, who structured it so that Edna received a fair price and a small ongoing income, and Edna accepted this arrangement with the dignity of a woman who is being very well looked after and knows it. Luther Payne, in the spring of 1878, produced the most extraordinary crop of corn that anyone in the Panhandle had seen in years, attributing it to the good winter rains and to a new soil preparation technique he had learned from a man passing through. He brought 24 ears to the Whitfield ranch on a July evening and sat on the porch with John and Frances and Robbie, who was 4 years old now and had no interest in corn but great interest in Luther's horse, and they talked the way people who have been through things together talk, with the ease and depth of established trust. "I think about 1874 sometimes," Luther said, looking out at the evening land. "What would have happened if you hadn't come to town, Miss Frances, Mrs. Whitfield?" "I came for a job that no longer existed," Frances said. "Everything after that was improvised." "The best things are," Luther said. John put his arm around her shoulders on the porch in the warm evening, and Robbie was being lifted up to look at the horse by Domingo, who had grown from a boy into a young man in the years of working at the ranch. And Clary was asleep inside because she slept where she chose and when she chose, and the land was gold in the last light. And Frances thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in a strange town in 1874 with a broken plan and a Derringer in her boot and no certainty of anything at all. She had found certainty. It had not looked the way she expected it to look. It had looked like a man with a newspaper he was pretending to read at the second table from the window, and apple preserves on Thursday mornings, and a ring with a small ruby in the evening light of a ranch yard, and 20 hours of labor and a cry that remade everything. It had looked like this porch and this man beside her and these children inside and out, and this land going gold and the stars beginning to appear, one by one, in the huge Panhandle sky. In the spring of 1879, they had a third child. A boy again, arriving with the ease of a third birth, red-faced and loud and apparently already in a disagreement with the world. They named him Thomas Ellis Whitfield, Thomas for Sheriff Henley, who had retired the previous year with the respect of the whole county, and Ellis for John's grandfather who had come to Texas before any of this was what it was now. Thomas was called Tom immediately, and he was from the beginning a child who moved through the world at a pace that made Frances and John tired just watching him, climbing everything, testing every limit, eating with a furious energy that suggested he was perpetually fueling some interior engine that ran very hot. Robbie, at 5, regarded his new brother with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has already been displaced once and has made his peace with the general state of things. Clary, at 2.5, treated the new baby as a fascinating but somewhat unreliable toy and had to be supervised near him with a vigilance that nobody had anticipated. John watched his 3 children at the supper table one evening that fall, and there was something in his expression that Frances had learned to read, a quality of deep, almost stunned gratitude, the expression of a man who has been given more than he knew how to ask for. "What are you thinking?" she asked because she liked to hear it in his own words. "I am thinking about 9 years ago," he said, "when I was sitting in this house alone and thinking this was as good as things were going to get." He looked at her. "I was wrong." "You were spectacularly wrong," she agreed pleasantly. He smiled at that, and she smiled back, and Tom threw a piece of cornbread onto the floor, and Clary immediately tried to retrieve it from the dog, and Robbie explained in complete sentences exactly why this was a bad idea, and the room was full of noise and light and life. The accounting practice continued to thrive into the early 1880s. Frances had, by 1881, 17 clients and had brought Sam Fowler up to full partnership status. The small office on the main street had been expanded into the adjacent space when it became available, and Frances had set up a proper filing system that became something of a marvel to the ranchers who came in and saw it. Maria Reyes often stopped by the office on her way to and from her medical calls, and the 2 women had formed a friendship that both valued, a friendship between 2 women in a country and time that did not always make room for women to be what they were, and that had required from both of them a certain quality of insistence. They talked sometimes, in the office over coffee, about the injustice of it, the way the law and the land and the economic structures of the frontier were arranged around the assumption that women were at best supporting figures in a story about men. Frances had felt this in San Antonio, where she had earned a quarter of what a man doing the same work would have earned. She felt it in smaller ways here too, in the occasional client who initially addressed questions to Sam Fowler rather than to her, the owner of the practice, or who expressed surprise that a woman could keep accounts as well as any man. "We do it anyway," Maria said once, with the particular calm of a woman who has internalized a hard truth and made it useful rather than defeating. "We do it anyway, and the work speaks for itself." "It does," Frances agreed, "though I wish it did not have to speak quite so loudly to be heard." This was the truth of their situation, stated plainly between 2 women who understood it and went on. In the summer of 1881, Robbie was 7, and had become obsessed with horses in the systematic and total way that certain children become obsessed with things, learning everything Tomas would teach him, spending every free hour in the barn and the corral. John watched this with satisfaction and a certain recognition. He had been much the same at 7 and his father before him. "He is going to be a horseman," Tomas told John one morning, with the authority of a man who knows horses and knows people. "His mother will want him to be a scholar," John said. "He can be both," Frances said from behind him, because she had very good hearing and had learned to walk quietly out of years of practice as a ranch wife. "The 2 things are not in conflict." John turned around. She was standing in the yard with her accounting ledger under her arm and a look of mild amusement and Tom on her hip, because Tom at 2 years old could not be put down anywhere for more than 3 minutes before he found something inadvisable to do. "Were you listening to that entire conversation?" he asked. "I was walking past," she said with dignity. She was listening, Tom confirmed with the arbitrary and devastating honesty of a 2-year-old. Frances gave Tom a look. Tom grinned. Clary at 4 had developed a deep interest in the garden, and a deeply competitive relationship with a chicken named Harriet who had been introduced to the yard by Grady, who maintained that chickens were useful and that city opinions about chickens were irrelevant in the panhandle. Clary and Harriet regarded each other across the yard with mutual suspicion and intermittent truces. The garden had expanded significantly from its original south wall strip. Frances had fenced a section beyond the house and planted it with vegetables and some flowers that served no practical purpose whatsoever except that she liked them. And in the summer when they were in bloom, they made the ranch house look like the kind of place that was not only functional but genuinely cared for, which it was. John came home one September evening from a cattle drive to Amarillo, where the railroad cattle pens were now well established, dusty and tired and smelling of trail, and walked into the yard and stopped. The garden was in its last bloom of the season, the late flowers going in the late afternoon light, and the house behind it with the windows lit warm because Frances had the lamps up and supper was cooking, and 3 children's voices were audible from inside. Robbie's measured tones explaining something to Tom, Clary's decisive corrections of whatever Robbie was saying. He stood in the yard for a moment just taking it in, the whole of it. Frances appeared in the doorway, and she saw him standing there, and she read his face the way she could read it now, fully and without effort, the way you read something you know by heart. She came down the porch steps and walked to him across the yard, and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her there in the September evening with the smell of the late flowers and the sounds of his children inside and the land around them that he had loved since he was 9 years old and that now at last was truly home. "Good trip?" she asked into his shoulder. "Good trip," he confirmed. "Best price we have gotten at the Amarillo pens." "I knew it would be," she said. "I ran the numbers." "Of course you did," he said, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. They ate supper together, all 5 of them at the long kitchen table, and Tom spilled his milk and Clary disputed the fairness of the distribution of the corn pudding, and Robbie read a book propped against his water glass until John reached over and gently closed it, and it was loud and imperfect and entirely right. After the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, they sat on the porch together in the dark, the way they often did when the evening was good, with coffee that was too late in the day for sensible people and the stars overhead in their enormous profusion. "I have been thinking," Frances said, "about the school." "What about it?" "Bernard Fletcher is a good teacher, but he is one man and there are now 32 children in that school building. I think the town needs to raise money for a second teacher." She paused. "I could organize a fundraising drive." "Of course you could," he said, "and I was thinking we could donate the first $100 from the practice." "Of course we should," he said. She turned to look at him in the dark. "You say of course to everything I suggest." "Not everything," he said. "I had reservations about the rooster." The rooster had been Clary's suggestion after the success of Harriet the chicken, and had been the subject of a family negotiation that lasted 2 weeks and ended in the rooster's presence at the ranch, a compromise that satisfied Clary and that everyone else had adapted to. "The rooster is fine," Frances said. "The rooster wakes me at 4:30 every morning," John said. "I know," she said. "It is fine." He laughed, soft in the dark, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have built something together and know its value. The fundraising drive for the second teacher was a considerable success, drawing contributions from ranchers and townspeople and several of the new businesses that had come to Dusty Creek with the railroad traffic. Bernard Fletcher hired a young woman from Dallas named Susan Park, who arrived in the spring of 1882 with 2 trunks of books and an enthusiasm for pedagogy that the children of Dusty Creek found stimulating in varying proportions. Robbie, at 8, was in Susan Park's class and thrived. He had his mother's systematic mind and his father's patient thoroughness, and Susan Park wrote in her first-term report that he was one of the most capable students she had taught, which Frances received with the specific quiet pride that is different from any other kind of pride, and that she did not entirely trust herself to speak about without her voice doing something embarrassing. She showed the report to John across the kitchen table, without comment. He read it. He folded it carefully and handed it back. His voice, when he spoke, was not entirely steady. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They looked at each other across the table, and neither of them said the larger thing, which did not need saying. Tom at 3 remained an ongoing logistical challenge of the most entertaining kind, showing no signs of slowing down and adding to his repertoire of inadvisable activities at a steady rate. He had, in the spring of 1882, learned to open the barn gate, which was a skill that served him in no way that was useful to the adults around him, and in many ways that were not. Tomas had taken to latching the gate in a new configuration that he said Tom could not figure out, and Tom had spent 4 days studying this with the focused intensity of a small engineer before achieving a breakthrough that nobody had anticipated, and Tomas had been forced to concede, with a respect that was genuine, that Tom Whitfield was going to be a difficult man to contain. In the fall of 1882, Frances discovered she was pregnant for the 4th time. She and John looked at each other across the kitchen table with an expression that was not quite the same as the expressions that had accompanied the previous 3 announcements, being composed this time of an additional layer of experienced knowledge and something that was close to humor. 4 children, John said. So it seems, Frances agreed. Hattie will be thrilled, he said, because Hattie's delight in each new Whitfield child was, at this point, a reliable phenomenon. Hattie was born thrilled about babies, Frances said. This will simply give her fresh material. The pregnancy was straightforward, and the birth, the following May, was swift enough that Maria Reyes barely had time to express surprise at the efficiency of it. A girl this time, a round and emphatic infant who announced her arrival in the world with a volume that suggested she had been preparing the statement for some time. They named her Ruth Eleanor Whitfield. Ruth because it was Frances's grandmother's name, and Eleanor because John had always liked it. She was called Ruthie from her first week, and she had, from the beginning, the specific quality of a youngest child who knows exactly what she is and has every intention of making the most of it. She was adored by her siblings in inverse proportion to the disruption she caused them, which was considerable. The ranch by 1884 was one of the most successful operations in the county. John's investment in better cattle stock had been sustained, and it showed in the quality of the herd, and Frances's accounting of the finances meant that the money the ranch made was deployed intelligently rather than lost in the gaps. They had built a new barn that was the best building on the property, and had extended the house with 2 more bedrooms, which was necessary given the number of people now sleeping in it. Pete Vasquez had married a woman from Amarillo named Consuela, who was a school teacher and who had taken a position at the Dusty Creek School alongside Susan Park, and they had built a house on the western edge of the ranch property, where the cottonwoods were thickest. Domingo had gone north to try his luck in the cattle country of the Indian Territory, and sent back occasional letters that were satisfyingly full of news. Grady was still at the ranch, older and stiffer in the winter, but with his opinions fully intact, and he had accepted Tomas's superior horsemanship with the injured dignity that was his default response to superior competence in others, and they had arrived at a working partnership that was built on mutual exasperation and genuine respect. Frances's accounting practice, by 1884, was the most established financial services operation in the county. Sam Fowler had grown from a young man asking to learn to a fully capable partner who handled the largest cattle operations with confidence, and Frances had shifted some of her client load to focus on the newer businesses coming into the area with the railroad, which had their own complicated financial structures that required more sophisticated analysis. She had also begun, in the past year, to teach a bookkeeping class at the schoolhouse on Thursday evenings for anyone who wanted to learn, and the class was attended by 8 people, including 2 women who were running their own small businesses, and wanted the tools to manage their finances properly. Maria Reyes came to the first class and sat in the back with her arms folded, and her expression suggesting that if anyone made a comment about the presence of women learning financial management, she would have words for them, which nobody did, because Dr. Maria Reyes was the kind of woman in whose medical care the entire town was invested, and people thought carefully before saying anything that might complicate that relationship. On a Thursday evening in October 1884, Frances finished the bookkeeping class and walked home along the main street in the early dark, the air cool and smelling of coming autumn, and thought about the 10 years that had passed since she had stepped off that stagecoach. 10 years. Dusty Creek was different now, more established, more settled, the raw frontier quality somewhat worn down into something resembling permanence. The church had been expanded. The school had its second building. There were 2 new businesses on the main street, a hardware store and a dressmaker's shop run by a woman named Miriam Hayes who had come from St. Louis and who had strong views about fashion and stronger views about everything else, and whose company Frances greatly enjoyed. She turned in at the ranch road and walked up toward the house with its lit windows, and she could see through the kitchen window the shapes of movement inside, the domestic choreography of a family in its evening. And she thought that if she had known, that first day in 1874, what was waiting for her down this road, she would have stepped off that stagecoach with considerably less anxiety. But then, she thought, perhaps the anxiety was part of it. Perhaps arriving somewhere with nothing certain was what made you pay attention, what made you notice everything and value it properly when it came. John was at the kitchen table helping Robbie with a mathematics problem when she came in, and Clary was reading by the lamp with Ruthie asleep against her side, and Tom was somewhere that a brief survey of the room did not locate, which was always slightly concerning. "Tom is in the barn," John said, without looking up. "He said he was going to check on the horses. I said he had 20 minutes. He has been in there 35, Frances said. "I know," John said. "He is fine. He is with Tomas." Frances hung up her coat and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, which was still warm, and came to the table and sat down next to John, who had been waiting for her to do exactly this. "How was the class?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Margaret Chen is very fast with figures. She is going to be better than most of my clients in 6 months. You will teach yourself out of students," he observed. "That is rather the point," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders at the table, briefly, the easy physical language of 2 people long and well acquainted with each other's proximity, and she leaned into it for a moment. "Papa," Robbie said, pointing at the paper, "I don't think this is right." John looked at the problem. Frances looked at it over his shoulder. "You are both wrong," she said, and reached for the pencil. Robbie looked at his father. His father looked at Robbie with an expression of philosophical acceptance. "She does this," Robbie said. "She does this," John confirmed. Frances worked through the problem with the focused patience that she brought to everything numerical, explaining each step, and Robbie followed it with the intensity of a child who actually wants to understand rather than simply to have the answer, which was one of the things about him that moved her most, this desire for genuine comprehension. When the problem was solved and understood, Robbie gathered his papers and went to bed, and Clary carried Ruthie up without being asked, and Tom came in from the barn smelling of horses, with the look of a 9-year-old who has spent an evening doing exactly what he wanted, and is not entirely sure how much of it is known. "Wash your hands and go to bed," Frances said. "Tomas was showing me about the new roans. Wash your hands and go to bed," Frances said again, with the same tone and inflection. Tom looked at his father. His father made a small gesture indicating that no help was available in this direction. Tom went to wash his hands and went to bed, and Frances heard his footsteps going up the stairs with the heaviness of theatrical reluctance. The house went quiet. The fire in the stove settled. The lamp on the table made its warm pool of light. "Come sit on the porch," John said. It was cool but not cold, the autumn air clean and carrying the smell of dry grass and distance, and the stars were out in full, the whole vast sky of the panhandle, the sky that Frances had learned in 10 years to read as a kind of presence rather than just an absence of ceiling. They sat on the porch in the two chairs that had been there since the second year of their marriage, chairs that had seen a great many evenings and held the shape of them in their wood and their wear. "I was thinking today," John said, "about that morning in Pete Drummond's store when you walked in with the flour sack." "I was thinking about that this evening," she said, surprised. 10 years, he said. "Almost exactly." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark land. She looked at his profile, which she knew as well as she knew her own, better perhaps because she had spent more time looking at it. The line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the quality of his hands resting on the arms of the chair. "I did not know," he said, "when I woke up the morning you arrived, that I was going to meet the person who was going to be the central fact of my life." "People rarely know that in the morning," she said. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." He turned to look at her. "I am grateful for it, every day, but I am saying it tonight. I am grateful for you, and for what we have made together." Frances felt something that was not sadness and not joy exactly, but the fullest possible form of both at once. The kind of feeling that only a decade of accumulated love can produce, that is made entirely of specific things, specific mornings and evenings, specific conversations, specific moments that have been lived through and kept and are still being kept. "John," she said. "So am I." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken her hand on the hill looking out over the panhandle 10 years ago, and she held it the way she had held it then, with everything she had. They sat there in the comfortable and complete darkness, the two of them, with the land around them that they had worked and loved and defended, with their children sleeping inside, with the years behind them and the years ahead still unknown but not frightening, because the most important uncertainty had long since resolved itself into something certain and lasting and real. The stars moved slowly over Dusty Creek, the way they had moved on the night Frances arrived, and the night before that, and every night for longer than any of them could imagine. And below them the land was quiet, and the cottonwoods rustled in a small wind, and the ranch house held its light against the dark like an answer to a question that Frances Monroe had been asking since she was 14 years old and alone, and not yet sure that the world had a place in it that was specifically hers. It did. It always had. She had simply needed to ride the stagecoach far enough to find it. The wind came up a little, warm even in October the way the panhandle wind could be, carrying with it the smell of distant rain, and somewhere to the north a coyote called once and went quiet, and the lamp in the kitchen window went on burning, steady and sure, the way it would go on burning for all the years to come.